News Talk on demand. Interruption-free audio where you want it, when you want it.
I am intrigued by the short-term and the long-term landscape for what Canada is going to look like when marijuana and cannabis are fully legalized tomorrow. So with cannabis legalization, is the world going to be much different tomorrow? Not around here. We have 51 licensed retailers. Maybe a dozen or 13 of them will be open tomorrow because the time horizon has been so fast. But what about the bigger cultural impacts? The way marijuana has been legalized, what do you think is going to be the effect several years down the road? One person who's been watching this closely, Jodie Emery, has been a cannabis activist for years. Married to Mark Emery, the man who was called the Prince of Pot. Jodie Emery has said throughout the process she is distressed by some of the developments in cannabis legalization. I thought she would be overjoyed. We find her in Toronto this morning. Jodie, welcome back, and it's great to chat.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show.
When you say distressed, what do you mean?
Well, I've been spending 15 years advocating for cannabis legalization from a civil liberties standpoint, and Mark has spent almost 25 years in Vancouver doing the same thing. And for us, legalization, you know, when we marched in the streets and held rallies, we said legalize it. And legalize it meant legalize what's already happening, legalize the people involved, legalize the plant and the businesses and all of the peaceful, nonviolent people. Let us be liberated from the criminal laws. But unfortunately, the legalization being proposed continues to criminalize people. There's no amnesty or pardons for possession or so-called trafficking like what I have myself. And Mark Emery spent 3 months in Saskatoon jail for passing a joint as trafficking. And Trudeau passed a joint, so he trafficked too. But we're not looking at any repairing of these criminal records of Canadians who are nonviolent. And we're also seeing that law enforcement budgets are going up. So instead of reducing the spending on law enforcement, which was one of the major reasons for legalization, we're seeing cops across Canada getting hundreds of millions of dollars more to keep going after cannabis. So 3 reasons to legalize: to stop criminalizing the people, stop criminalizing the plant and industry, and stop wasting law enforcement money. None of those objectives are really being met. What we're seeing is legalization of government-sold pot and the decriminalization of possession of 30 grams of government-sold pot. But all the other cannabis and all the other products and businesses are still illegal. They're now called illicit cannabis, and there's serious punishments, up to 14 years in prison available for engaging in cannabis that isn't approved by the government.
Jodie Emery, cannabis activist, joining us from Toronto this morning. So the argument that it would be a fully legal regime, and let me fill in the blanks. What I hear you saying is this would be like selling parsley in a grocery store, not selling a regulated substance.
Well, I want proper, reasonable regulations. When it comes to farmers markets, for example, when you go to a farmer's market and you buy food grown in somebody's backyard or the baked goods that they made in their kitchen, there's no federal regulation or oversight on those products, even though there's proof that food kills people if it's not done right. And you've got coffee being sold all across Canada every day. It's an addictive substance. It's an addictive stimulant drug. But there's no age limits. There's no rules about how strong your coffee can be. There's no interference from the government about where you can open up one of these shops. And when it comes to alcohol, it's everywhere. Society is saturated with alcohol. The regulations allow for a lot of booze to be consumed and abused, and that causes real crime and real harm. So cannabis should be regulated for what it is. It's an agricultural crop, and in fact, right beside me on the wall is a photo I took in Saskatchewan in a hemp field 10 years ago of these beautiful plants being grown as an industrial crop. We should be regulating cannabis for what it is, but now it's being treated like plutonium or some horrific new thing that's going to destroy civilization. That's not the kind of regulations we should be having.
But it's being treated, for all intents and purposes, at least provincially, like alcohol. It's an intoxicant. It's available, but it's still going to be regulated. So it shouldn't be treated like alcohol?
It's funny when we compare to alcohol, because on the one hand, every single day, people are killed and hurt by alcohol, and crimes of violence and aggression are caused by alcohol. Cannabis helps people and saves lives every single minute of every day. It's the opposite of alcohol, and it doesn't contribute to crimes of assault or violence or aggression. It's not a drug like alcohol. So alcohol actually costs a lot of money and a lot of harm to health, whereas cannabis is the opposite. And when people have access to cannabis, they use less alcohol, as well as opioids. Opioids and the crisis of overdoses, that's a real drug crisis, and cannabis reduces the use and overdoses of opioids. So comparing cannabis and alcohol, sure, it's a recreational substance for many, but it improves health. It doesn't harm health. And when you're looking at alcohol, how it's available, well, in some ways, we should be allowing cannabis to be regulated like alcohol. I want to get alcohol and cannabis on airplanes. I want to go to a community center and watch a hockey game with the kids and be able to buy weed. I want to see advertisements everywhere for weed. I want to see restaurants serving up weed alongside the food. But that's not really what I want. I mean, what I'm saying is alcohol is everywhere, and every province in this country is addicted financially to alcohol. That's why the alcohol control boards get to control cannabis sales across Canada, because they know they're going to see a drop in alcohol revenues when people have the safer choice available to them.
Jodie Emery, when you and your husband got into trouble over the cannabis culture brand, I remember the stories at the time, and it was only, a year ago, I guess, the drug charges related to that were dealt with. Would it have been better for you if you'd played inside the lines with pending legalization? Could you have been a part of the evolution to a broader kind of legalization? Because in many respects, you're kind of still on the outside, aren't you?
Yes, a lot of us pioneers and prohibition victims were being locked out from being allowed to participate in the legal regime, and we're being locked up if we dare try. So for us, it's very difficult, because cannabis culture as a brand began in 1994. That's a quarter of a century almost ago. It began as a magazine, a head shop selling hemp clothing, bongs, and vaporizers, and as a lounge since 2006, where people can bring their own cannabis and come together. We only began the dispensary model in early 2016 because Trudeau said dispensaries would be legalized, and Uber and Airbnb broke the law but were regulated into existence. So we assumed, well, now that Mark has finished his 5 years in U.S. prison for financing legalization activism, maybe we should have a shot at making some money since we're broke. We created this industry in many respects, and now we're broke and excluded. So we started the dispensaries to do with the weed money what Mark did with seed money, to finance activism. So I have been engaged. I testified to the House of Commons federally. I testified to the Ontario State Legislature, testified to the Toronto Police, requested a role on the task force, but Bill Blair said absolutely not, even though the health minister said I should be allowed. I've campaigned for office 5 times I've run, including a Liberal nomination when they were presenting legalization, and I was the best spokesperson. I've done everything possible in every which way to try and change and reform these laws. But because I am outspoken and I receive many opportunities to share this message on behalf of the cannabis movement, that's made me a target, just like Mark was made a target. So I want to be legal. That's why I'm a legalization activist. But if the government continues to tell us we're not allowed to be legal, whose fault is that? Not ours.
Jodie Emery. So you're going to continue to push this thing? Challenge
Absolutely.
This new law?
My work is not over. In fact, a few years ago I joked, well, I'm done my job as an activist because there's no more propaganda. There's no more misinformation. Everybody wants it legal. Dispensaries are opening. Businesses are starting up. Here we go. But now the federal government sounds a lot like the Harper conservatives. Marijuana is a threat to public health and public safety. We need to restrict and limit access. We need tough criminal laws. We need to punish the pot people to protect the kids. I mean, children are actually receiving medical marijuana, and it's saving their lives. So all of this hyperbole and hysteria and propaganda is a throwback to the past. I feel like I've suddenly 10 years ago having to argue about why it's wrong to criminalize peaceful people and a plant that grows like a weed. So in many respects, I have a lot of work ahead to do. And in other ways, we have a lot more allies than before. There's actually an organization I'm helping launch very soon called Fair Cannabis Canada. And we're going to work for fairness in laws and regulations across the board. For licensed producers, they should be allowed to advertise and brand their products. Retail stores should be allowed to open up. Lounges, too. We should address the drug testing that happens at workplaces where people lose their jobs even though they're great workers. They just used cannabis. We need to address the traveling rights. We need to address medical marijuana use and the taxation, which is excessive and totally unjustified. So across the board, from dispensaries to edibles to medicine to taxes to law enforcement, advertising, we've got a lot of issues of unfairness that need to be addressed. So my activism work will certainly have to continue. Although I do joke, if the government wants me to stop complaining, do the right thing and I'll have nothing to complain about.
Good hearing from you as always. Thanks for this.
Great. Thanks for the chance to talk.
Jodie Emery, cannabis activist. Well, you get the feeling she is undeterred, but she calls the new law something that is still restrictive. It still criminalizes cannabis users. Do judge. Do you think Jodie Emery is a breath of fresh air? Do you think she's part of the cannabis culture problem? Join the conversation on 650 CKOM and 980 CJME.